you. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. So most of my work has been about more metaphysical issues in free will and philosophy of mind and philosophy of religion. And since this conference was about social issues, I'm exploring new terrain. So the paper is more exploratory than argumentative. So I hope you'll bear with me, and I look forward to the discussion after. On July 18th of this year, an autistic man wandered from his care facility in North Miami, and his behavioral therapist, a black man named Charles Kinsey, went to retrieve him. A woman observing them called 911 and reported that the autistic man looked mentally ill and might have a gun. Another observer began filming the scene when 3 police officers arrived. In the video, Kinsey can be seen lying on his back with his hands in the air, trying to talk his patient into doing the same, telling the officers that he works in a group home and saying, all he has is a toy truck in his hand, a toy truck. That's all it is. There is no need for guns. One of the officers, Jonathan Aleda, shot Kinsey in the leg. Kinsey was then handcuffed and, according to his lawyer, left bleeding on the pavement for 20 minutes. Kinsey reported that when he asked Aleda why he had shot him, the officer answered, "I don't know." In a statement released later, Aleda said, "I took this job to save lives and help people. I did what I had to do in a split second to accomplish that, and hate to hear others paint me into something I am not." What others have painted him as is, we might suppose, a kind of racist. The kind who would see a black man lying on the sidewalk with his hands in the air as a kind of threat. Of course, one cannot prove in an individual case like this that race was a motivating factor in the shooting. Aleda later claimed he was trying to protect Kinsey from the autistic man who he thought was armed. However, there's mounting evidence that in the US, police officers are more likely to stop, push to the ground or against a wall, pepper spray, and handcuff without arresting blacks than whites in similar circumstances. Evidence that strongly suggests that race is playing a role in the officer's use of force. And yet evidence also suggests that an officer whose behavior is so affected by race may not be consciously racist at all. He may be, as Aleda describes himself, someone who took his job to save lives and help others, someone personally committed to equality and justice for all. Why then are such officers more likely to use force against blacks than whites? One theory that has recently come to the fore in explanations of police officers' use of excessive force involves a phenomenon called implicit bias. Implicit biases are evaluations of social groups that are largely outside of conscious awareness or control. As Michael Brownstein and Jennifer Saul explain, these biases are thought to involve associations between social groups, such as Black Americans, and concepts, such as violence, and result at least in part from stereotypes that are common in the culture of those who hold them. One measure of these biases is the implicit association test, which requires a subject to sort words or pictures into categories as fast as possible while making as few errors as possible. For instance, a subject may be presented with an image of a face, either white or black, and asked to sort the image to the left under the word white or to the right under the word black, while below each color word is the word good or bad. Most white subjects, about 70 or 80%, are quicker and better at the task when the word white is paired with good and black with bad than the other way around. So the explanation for this is when white is with good, they can more easily categorize this as one thing. When it's white and bad, then they have to remember 2 things. As Brownstein and Saul explain, Researchers consider this to represent an implicit preference for white faces over black faces. That is because they can more easily associate white and good. So they call it a preference. Surprisingly, such preferences are found not only among those who explicitly disavow racial prejudices and devote their lives to counteracting them, but also among those who are targeted by them. Roughly 40% of blacks show an implicit preference for white faces over black faces. This may explain why some black police officers use greater force against blacks as well. And there is further evidence that these preferences or biases do affect social behavior. In one study involving a computer simulation, participants have been found more likely to shoot an unarmed black man than an unarmed white man. Indeed, the effects of implicit bias may be quite pervasive, affecting everything from eye contact and ease at conversing, to hiring and promotion decisions, to medical treatment and criminal sentencing, and so serve to justify the sense that many black Americans have that, in the words of the Black Lives Matter movement, there is virulent anti-black racism that permeates our society. One question being raised by the more philosophically inclined researchers on implicit bias is whether those who hold these biases and whose actions are affected by them are morally responsible for the biases themselves or for the affected actions. Arguments have been offered on both sides, but my guess is that the answer will not be a simple yes or no to either question, since whether an individual is responsible for a particular attitude or for the behavior caused by that attitude would seem to depend on whether the individual was consciously aware of the attitude and whether the formation or suspension of that attitude was under her control, as well as in the case of behavior, whether the agent could control the effects of the attitude. And both awareness and control seem to come in degrees. Given the characterization of implicit biases, though, as well as the research showing how difficult they are to counteract, I would hazard to say that implicit biases and the actions they affect are not paradigm loci of responsibility. I don't want to wade into the murky waters of moral responsibility today, however, but rather propose that we think of implicit bias under the category of sin. Some Christian philosophers and theologians have argued that sin is not a moral category at all. Marilyn McCord Adams, for instance, contends that sin is fundamentally not a moral but a theological notion, since it signifies some sort of impropriety in the relationship between created persons and God, and since the relationship between God and creatures is not a moral one. While I do not want to deny that God and humans may have a moral relationship, and so that sin might also be a moral category, I appreciate Adams' point that the biblical catalog of sin includes much that we do not freely choose, and for which we would not seem to be fully responsible. So here's her biblical catalog of sin includes not only 1, conscious voluntary actions, but 2, emotions such as anger, and cognitive states such as belief, not within our direct voluntary control. 3, dispositions, habits, and inclinations that resist the normative ordering of the self. And 4, states or conditions of uncleanness, such as the abominations of Leviticus. Considering such biblical data, I think it's helpful to distinguish 2 ways we might conceive of sin. Ian McFarland helpfully spells out this distinction in the Oxford Handbook of Systematic Theology. First, there are actual sins, those decisions we make or actions we take that manifest a particular kind of will, perhaps best characterized as disobedient or in violation of God's command. And second, there's original sin, a state of being or orientation toward such disobedience, which is prior to any decision of the will, but which McFarland says causes or conditions our sinful acts of will. While the biblical descriptions of and prescriptions about sin are many and varied, when we focus on passages that speak of sin as an orientation or state of being, we see that sin is something that has dominion over human beings, something that puts the will in bondage, as McFarland says. One finds this emphasis especially in Paul's writings, such as his letter to the Romans. Speaking from his own experience, Paul says in chapter 7, this is probably a very familiar passage to many of you, but I'll just read it. I am of the flesh, sold into slavery under sin. I do not understand my own actions, for I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing I hate. I can will what is right, but I cannot do it. Now, if I do what I do not want, it is no longer I that do it, but sin that dwells within me. So I find it to be a law that when I want to do what is good, evil lies close at hand. For I delight in the law of God in my inmost self, but I see in my members another law at war with the law of my mind, making me captive to the law of sin that dwells in my members. Now, I said I didn't want to wade into the waters of responsibility, but let me just say this. Paul's picture of sin as something that overpowers and enslaves seems to be in tension with his insistence that the infliction of divine wrath on sinners is entirely justified. I think Paul was a kind of compatibilist about the lack of ability to do otherwise and moral responsibility. But for those who have strong incompatibilist intuitions, you face a choice when confronted with such passages. Either accept Paul's suggestion that sin is something for which we are ultimately responsible in Galen Strawson's heaven and hell sense of responsibility, and for which we deserve punishment, and take his talk of the unavoidability of sin as hyperbole, or take his emphasis on the unavoidability of sin as quite literal, and interpret his discussion of divine wrath in light of the larger biblical corpus, including Paul's own writings, that highlight God's compassion and mercy. I'm inclined to go the latter route, understanding sin as a state of being in which we find ourselves before we are fully formed as rational and responsible agents. I find very plausible the analysis of original sin offered by Thomas Talbot, who contends that the environment in which we develop as persons, in combination with our natural-born instincts, virtually guarantees that we will sin, in the sense of acting in egocentric ways and in disobedience to divine command. On the basis of his view of human nature, Talbot insists with the psalmist that the Lord does not deal with us according to our sins, nor repay us according to our iniquities. Why not? Because he knows how we were made. He remembers that we are but dust. Marilyn McCord Adams paints a similar picture of human development. This is a long passage from her work. She says, "We start life ignorant, weak, and helpless, psychologically so lacking in a self-concept as to be incapable of choice. We learn to become people capable of choice only with difficulty over a long period of time and under the extensive influence of other non-ideal choosers. Further, human development is the interactive product of human nature and its environment. And from early on, we humans are confronted with problems that we cannot adequately grasp or cope with, and in response to which we mount without fully conscious deliberation, inefficient adaptational strategies. Yet the human psyche is a habit forming in such a way that these reactive patterns, based as they are on a child's inaccurate view of the world and strategic options, become entrenched in the individual's personality. Having begun thus immature, we arrive at adulthood in a state of impaired freedom, as our childhood adaptational strategies continue to distort our perceptions and behavior." End of quote. Of course, if freedom and responsibility come in degrees, as I've already suggested, then the imperfect freedom we develop may leave room for some degree of responsibility for our actions, making blame and punishment of each other appropriate, perhaps justified in part by considerations of our own moral reform, as well as the consequences of blame and punishment for the rest of society. But such blame and punishment will no doubt be tempered by significant sympathy for fellow humans who share our sinful condition and prompt us to forgive those who trespass against us, as we too need to be forgiven. In any case, to return to our discussion of the nature and consequences of sin, Paul is insistent that our own sin is not only something which we cannot understand and do not in some sense will, but perhaps because of this, something from which we cannot free ourselves, but from which we need liberation. Chapter 7 of Romans continues, "Wretched man that I am, who will rescue me from this body of death? Thanks be to God through Jesus Christ our Lord." Now, I think if we take some recent cases of police officers' use of excessive force against blacks as cases in which implicit bias is at play, the descriptions of these cases fit well with Paul's characterization of sin, both phenomenologically, that is, what it feels like from the inside, and realistically, what's going on behind the scenes. First, to return to the example with which we started, Jonathan Aleda, the officer who shot Charles Kinsey. He seemed puzzled by his own behavior, as if some alien force had caused him to act against his most deeply held values. Recall that when asked by Kinsey why Aleda had shot him, Aleda replied, "I don't know." Indeed, Aleda later insisted on what seems to me a plausible story, that he had good intentions, not to harm but to help, that he did not, consciously at least, view blacks as in any way inferior to whites, but that he was committed to egalitarian ideals, and that this very commitment had motivated him to enter his line of work. One can almost imagine him uttering Paul's famous words as he considered what moved him to shoot an innocent man. "I do not understand my own actions, for I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing that I hate." This, I submit, is the phenomenology of behavior motivated by implicit bias. And according to the latest research, the reality is that implicit biases are not things that we can overcome directly on our own by intentional efforts to suppress them. Such efforts may actually cause the biases to rebound, meaning that their effects on our behavior are strengthened as a result. Who indeed will save us from this wretched state? In fact, there seem to be some ways to mitigate the effects of implicit bias on behavior and to weaken or eradicate the biases themselves. Research on this matter is still in its infancy, but it looks to me like the proposed mitigation strategies parallel those recommended by and for Christians in their struggle against sin. So let me begin with an overview of what I take to be the Christian response to sin before going on to highlight similarities in the literature on implicit bias and to propose further practices based on Christian spiritual teaching for combating racial bias. As you will see, my focus is not on what we should do about them, that is, the police officers who are using excessive force motivated by racial bias. Rather, my focus is on what we should do about ourselves, since if the research is right, many of us probably hold similar biases, which lead us to act in discriminatory ways without our even realizing it. According to Christian teaching, the first step a person can take in her struggle against sin, and so on the path to sanctification, is to acknowledge her sinful condition. Ian McFarlane writes this: "To affirm the doctrine of original sin is to confess that one's own sinfulness conditions one's every act. It is therefore not directly perceptible, but is known only in its being overcome. This side of glory, however, this overcoming remains in process and is never definitive, which means that the Christian must ever confess herself a sinner. If this confession is not to be a mere formality, it must be shaped by a commitment to find out the hidden depths of one's own sin in ongoing dialogue with those whose suffering provides the necessary reference point both for naming sin and for correcting one's participation in it." So a few things I think are noteworthy about this passage. First, on McFarlane's view, the orientation to sin is not something that is directly perceptible. What I take this to mean is at least that we cannot by introspection alone become aware of all the beliefs, desires, and other mental states that form this orientation. There's a kind of hidden depth to sin that can only be revealed in overt behavior. Second, and relatedly, our confession of sin must be both tentative and ongoing as we uncover more and more of this hidden side of ourselves by interacting with others who may be the victims of our sinful ways. Adams also writes about the process of sanctification, or what she calls the path to Christian maturity, which she describes as involving, quote, "a series of steps in taking responsibility for things that were not, at least to a large extent, products of our fully informed, well-considered, conscious, rational choice, including A, facing the truth about oneself, one's deeply entrenched adaptational strategies, one's attitudes and actions, B, owning that however one may have got that way, these are one's own actions, and that this is in fact the person one has become, and C, choosing out of or against these patterns." It's important to emphasize, as Adams does, that the confession of sin involves acknowledging that what might seem like an alien force governing our behavior, leading us to act against our most deeply held values and personal commitments, is really a part of us. This is what taking responsibility in the first place amounts to. Another point to highlight in both McFarlane and Adams' writing is that the human response to sin is to be an active process. McFarlane speaks of finding out the hidden depths of our sin, while Adams counsels us to choose out of or against our sinful patterns of behavior. Of course, the process of sanctification is God-initiated, sustained, and completed. But Paul counsels us to work out our salvation as God is at work in us. What this means is that after coming to see through the grace of Christ the depths of our sinfulness, we do not continue in sin so that grace may abound. By no means. Nor do we sit back and wait, as it were, for God to work in us. Rather, we respond to the divine promptings as best we can, actively engaging in the process of finding out and choosing against, in which the Spirit is leading us. The various traditions within the Christian faith have emphasized different disciplines as central to this process. But given my interest in implicit bias, I'd like to focus here on just one, which I think is especially relevant. That is the spiritual exercises of Ignatius of Loyola. These exercises are a set of prayers and meditations which Ignatius described as aimed at the conquest of self, and which he wrote for use under the guidance of an experienced spiritual director. Ignatius considered the psychological influences that affect our behavior to be spirits, and developed a system for discerning the good ones which lead to God from the bad ones which lead to sin. On his view, good spirits can produce positive emotions and attitudes like love, joy, and peace, but also desolation in order to induce changes in behavior. While evil spirits can produce confusion and doubt, but also contentment to make you resist such changes. Thus, the exercises are focused on examining one's own psyche, interpreting one's daily behavior for signs of the spirits, as well as cultivating one's desires and passions so that they are more in line with the will of Christ. Part of this cultivation involves imaginative readings of biblical stories, in which the reader places herself within the scenes, experiencing for herself the events therein. For instance, in one meditation, the subject is instructed to form a mental image of the Nativity, saying to herself, "I will become a poor, miserable, and unworthy slave, looking upon the Holy Family, contemplating them, and ministering to their needs as though I were present there." She then observes and considers the journey and the suffering which they undergo in order that our Lord might be born in extreme poverty, and after so many labors. After hunger and thirst, heat and cold, insult and injuries, he might die on the cross, and all for me. An interesting feature of this sort of meditation is that it's aimed at developing in the subject such attitudes as sorrow for one's sins and love for Christ, attitudes that may affect the subject's subsequent behavior as she aims to do Christ's will and follow in his lead. And yet the meditations do not focus the subject's attention on her behavior or even on her attitudes. They simply focus the attention on the biblical stories. This suggests that the imaginative reading of those stories and the intellectual insights and emotional responses that the reading evokes may affect changes in a person's attitudes and behavior in ways that she need not consciously or directly control. The Christian response to sin, as summarized by McFarland and Adams and outlined in Ignatius's spiritual exercises, seem to me in some ways to parallel the strategies contemporary psychologists propose for overcoming implicit bias. Patricia Devine, a professor of psychology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, outlines the basic steps involved in this process as follows. 1, becoming aware of one's implicit bias. 2, being concerned about the consequences of the bias. And 3, learning to replace the biased response with non-prejudiced responses, ones that more closely match the values people consciously believe that they hold. Devine conducted a study in which one group of non-black college students learned about implicit bias and how it perpetuates discrimination, and were taught strategies to combat bias, such as empathizing with and imagining people as the opposite of their stereotypes. They were then compared with a control group who started out with equivalent measures of implicit bias, but who were not given any educational intervention. After 4 weeks, the experimental group showed a significant reduction in their implicit bias over the control group. This difference persisted through week 8 when the study ended. In another study, Calvin Leigh and a team of researchers held a research contest to experimentally compare interventions for reducing the expression of implicit racial prejudice. Of the 17 different interventions they looked at, the most effective, called vivid counter-stereotypic scenario, involved the participants as the subject of the story, vividly imagining herself in a threatening situation in which she was assaulted by a white man and then rescued by a black man. There is more to be said about strategies for combating implicit bias, but the parallels with Christian practice should already be apparent. The importance of confession, in the sense of recognizing oneself as harboring implicit bias, and so potentially acting in ways that perpetuate discrimination. Repentance, in the sense of expressing concern for the consequences of one's bias, and amendment of life, in the sense of learning and practicing strategies that can change one's mind and behavior. The particular combination of strategies Leigh and colleagues found to be most effective bears interesting similarities to Ignatius's exercises of reading Scripture, especially the emphasis on putting oneself in the scene and vividly imagining it from a first-person perspective. Divine study, in which the participants were not only exposed to counter-stereotypical images of Black people, but also taught to empathize with them, presumably by trying to take on their perspective, also finds a parallel in the Ignatian spiritual exercises. For instance, in one meditation, the reader takes the perspective of the Holy Trinity, looking down on the face of the earth, seeing the plight of the people, and saying, "Let us work the redemption of mankind." In another, one imagines Christ hanging on the cross and asks for pain, tears, and suffering with Christ's suffering. The theme of this conference on which I was asked to speak is Christian philosophy and public engagement. And it was suggested in the call for papers that an emphasis would be placed on pressing social issues regarding which Christians find themselves in conflict with other groups. But when it comes to the pressing social issue of implicit biases that are pervasive in and detrimental to our society at large, I don't see a conflict. Rather, I think that ancient Christian spirituality and modern experimental psychology have much in common, and that the church can both serve as a resource to society and also learn something from those outside it who are already engaged in research and work for reform. First, the church can offer its resources in the form of its rituals of confession, prayer, meditation, and the like, which are integral to the process of overcoming sin in general, and which can be tailored to focus particularly on the sins of bias and discrimination. We might take as a model the way in which churches have helped those struggling with alcoholism. Alcoholics Anonymous, after all, emerged from a movement that modeled itself after first-century Christianity and involves a 12-step process of recovery that embodies the principles of Christian teaching on sin and sanctification. As summarized by the American Psychological Association, the process involves admitting that one cannot control one's alcoholism, recognizing a higher power that can give strength, examining past errors with the help of a sponsor, making amends, and learning to live a new life with a new code of behavior. The church could similarly open its doors to those who would like to learn about and overcome implicit bias, perhaps inviting psychologists and other researchers with the most cutting-edge knowledge of the issue to teach and counsel alongside its priests and pastors. Important in the church's efforts will be encouraging people not only to learn about implicit biases and adopt practices like meditation and prayer to counteract them, but also to interact with members of other racial groups, as such interactions and efforts to individuate by seeking specific information about members of other racial groups are also known to reduce implicit racial biases. Such efforts, starting with the attempt to better racially integrate our own churches, make sense in light of and may be framed in terms of the biblical images of renewed humanity, in which the categories of race and ethnicity no longer divide us. The strategies I've discussed so far to combat implicit bias are not without their critics, however, and the church must pay heed to these critics and what can be learned from them as well. A team of researchers studying strategies aimed at prejudice reduction in South Africa found that such strategies may distract from the main causes of and solutions to problems of racial discrimination, and may even exacerbate these problems by diminishing the extent to which social injustice is acknowledged, rejected, and challenged. They note that prejudice reduction typically involves the reduction of salience of intergroup boundaries and the creation of positive intergroup emotions such as liking and trust, whereas collective action, which strives to rupture the status quo and bring systemic change to unjust social institutions, tends to involve a strengthening of intergroup boundaries and the intensification of feelings of anger and outrage, which increase group conflict. The authors do not recommend abandoning attempts at prejudice reduction, which they acknowledge may be crucial for producing change in some contexts, but they caution against taking prejudice reduction to be the exclusive model of social change, particularly in societies like South Africa, characterized by historically entrenched patterns of inequality. The Church would do well to attend to this point too, and to continue its prophetic role in raising consciousness of racial inequality in America, as well as supporting collective action groups like Black Lives Matter. In this paper, I've summarized some research on implicit bias and proposed that we think of it as a form of sin, characterized most fundamentally not as an act, but as an orientation which we may not have direct access to or control over, but which can lead us to act against our better selves or consciously held values and commitments. I've also noted the similarities between the strategies proposed by experimental psychologists for overcoming implicit biases and the disciplines developed by Christians as part of the path to sanctification. Finally, I have suggested some ways in which the Church might offer its resources to a society struggling to overcome bias and discrimination, and ways in which the Church's teaching and ministry might be informed by the latest research on implicit bias. My proposals and suggestions may go against the grain of this conference with its emphasis on conflict between Christians and secular culture, but I think it's in the spirit of biblical teaching, both in its emphasis on the universality of our sinful condition and on the ways in which the Spirit may be at work in the world. Thank you.